This podcast contains descriptions of death and violence that some listeners may find upsetting.
On Valentine's Day in 1945, a brutal murder took place which remains unsolved, 75 years on. Now, this murder isn't some gangland killing where people are afraid to speak out, and it isn't a domestic crime of passion where the suspect got off on a legal technicality. No, it's not a tragic death where the actual case is in doubt or open to interpretation. It is a savage and brutal murder with no apparent motive. Not only that, it occurred in a sleepy village in the heart of England. If that isn't enough to get you interested, then let's throw in some local folklore and superstition with stories of witchcraft. Alright, let's find out some more about the location. Lower Quinton is a small and unassuming Warwickshire village just 6 miles from Stratford-upon-Avon. According to the 2011 census, the population of the two villages in the parish was under 2,000. It lies on the Heart of England Way, a long-distance walk of around 160 kilometres through the Midlands of England. Sounds like a beautiful setting to visit. Spend a few hours, doesn't it? Well, it is, actually.
Yeah.
But it does have, as we will find out, Jack, a sinister episode in its past.
Indeed.
English villages like this aren't complete with at least one ancient pub, oh yes, and a medieval church, and we're outside St Swithin's right now. If you visit Lower Quinton, you will notice the imposing plateau of Meon Hill. Meon Hill is 190 metres above sea level and is visible above the farms and villages in the area. While it's not that high and has fields and hedgerows on the slopes, it has an odd look that makes it stand out. So anyway, that's the ancient history, if you like. Let's talk about the more recent and more sinister history of Lower Quinton. Jack, tell me a bit more about this spooky place.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Having learnt the introduction and the history of this area, let's bring ourselves more up to date to 1945 and the events that took place at Fern's Farm on the slopes of Meon Hill. It's a case that's even baffled the foremost Scotland Yard detective of the era. That was Chief Inspector Robert Fabian. So Wednesday, the 14th of February 1945, the Second World War had been raging for over 5 years, and the war had obviously taken its toll on the country, even in quiet farming communities like Lower Quinton. The farms were providing essential food for the people, but farm workers were obviously in short supply. Most young men were serving in the armed forces, and women were taking on the roles usually done by men. Edith Walton was 33 years old and lived in a small cottage with her 74-year-old uncle named Charles Walton. Charles was an agricultural worker and had lived at Lower Quinton all of his life. In fact, he'd occupied the cottage at 50 in Lower Quinton since World War I. He was a widower. His wife had died in 1927, and they had adopted Edith from the age of 3 after her mother had died. Edith's father, Charles's brother, was still alive and lived at 30 Henley Street in nearby Stratford. Charles Walton would give Edith £1 per week housekeeping. He also paid the 3 shillings per week rent on the cottage, as well as buying their coal and meat. He received an old age pension of 10 shillings a week, but also took on some casual farm work for a local farmer named Alfred Potter at Furze Farm.
Okay, Jack, you've asked me to drive you to the top of Meon Hill, and here we are, as near as we can get in the car. What's all this about?
On the day of the murder, Edith Walton had been working as a printer's assembler for the Royal Society of Arts, which strangely enough had relocated during the war to the area. Edith returned home about 6 p.m. on a normal routine, expected her uncle Charles to be already at home from his work on the farm. This is Valentine's Day, it's February, obviously it's dark now. Edith went to see her next door neighbour, an agricultural worker by the name of Harry Beasley, and together they made their way to Furze Farm to alert Alfred Potter, the farm manager, that Charles was missing, had not come home. Potter said he'd seen Charles earlier in the day slashing hedges in a part of the farm named Hillground, which is just on the slope up towards Meon Hill, where we are now. The three of them set out in the semi-darkness to check the location where Charles had last been seen working. When they reached Hillground, Edith was completely unprepared for what she'd discovered. She was immediately overcome with grief, shock, and began to scream loudly. Harry Beasley tried to pacify her and bring her away from the appalling scene that was before them.
So what on earth had she discovered?
Well, Charles Walton's body was clearly dead and lying near to a hedgerow.
Wow.
Like all corpses, it takes the finder a few seconds to realise what is before them.
That's in your experience as a detective, then?
Yeah, there's something surreal about a lifeless person as opposed to somebody lying down. Even bodies that have no obvious injuries can appear strangely unreal. The position of their lifeless limbs can make them not quite look human. And the position of Charles Walton's body was certainly odd. And the injuries, what was before them, told those present that this was a murder and a savage one. Not just he died.
Right.
So Edith clearly needs to be taken away.
So what had happened then? What had happened to Charles Walton?
Charles had been beaten repeatedly over the head with his own walking stick, and he'd also received horrific injuries from the tools and the implements that he'd been using for his work. His neck had been cut open with the slash hook.
This is the implement that's used for cutting the wood in the hedge, the stems in the hedge, yeah?
Correct, yeah, like an extendable lopper, I suppose we would call them
so
now.
It's a big sharp, heavy iron implement.
Yeah. Even more sort of horrific was the fact that he'd been pinned to the ground. The prongs of his own pitchfork had been driven either side of his neck and into the earth to hold him there.
So this is a classic pitchfork, has a long handle and it has two horseshoe-shaped tines at the bottom, doesn't it? And that had been pushed over his neck, over his neck, into the ground, basically pinning him to the ground. So quite a savage attack on this poor man. And this is a 72-year-old man who's he's still working on the farm. He's probably reasonably fit for his age, but he's he's not a young guy, man. Is he? He's not a young guy. Yeah. I
mean, clearly Charles Walton was not meant to survive this attack. His killer or his killers had surely made sure of that.
Okay, so we're going to go somewhere else now. We're going to go and try and get a little bit closer to where this happened. And you can tell me a little bit more about this, because the more you tell me, the more fascinating this becomes.
Yeah, sure.
Jack, do you think these hedges would have been pretty typical of the ones that Charles Walton was working on? I mean, it's thorny stuff, isn't it? That's definitely hawthorn.
Yes,
wild roses and ivy, and it's dense.
It's an established hedgerow, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you can see the extra growth on top, which they're obviously trying to keep it down to about 6 foot.
So he'd have been slashing that with the slash hook, and then taking the cuttings off with the pitchfork and piling them up, and maybe going to put them on a bonfire or something like that.
Yeah, they were the tools. Yeah. They were the tools that he had for the job. Yeah,
slash hook. Yeah. And when he was found, the pitchfork, it had been wedged somehow, hadn't it? So it was standing up with the handle of the pitchfork pretty much vertical.
I think the handle was actually at an angle, sort of bent backwards. He was lying on his side, sort of almost where we stood now, just to the side of the hedgerow, probably out of view to, where we are now.
It was dark, wasn't it, when they came looking for him, So do you think this was an attempt to conceal the body or what?
Well, I think just the location he was working at, pretty out the way. Had they not gone looking for him knowing he'd been working there, probably wouldn't have been found for some time maybe. But obviously Edith was keen to find out where he was. It was unusual that he wasn't at home, and they found him, within a few hours of his death.
So what do you do then in 1945? Do you ring 999 or 911 or... How do you call for help?
There's a local parish constable, so Harry and Edith go back to the village and alert the local constable, who then would speak to his colleagues in Stratford to say what he's doing. Clearly he was obviously informed that this looked like a murder. He was pretty clear about that. Then he went back to the scene to have a look for himself.
There's a gate here, we can go through this. Because as you can probably hear, it's quite a cold, windy day today, and it's very muddy because we've had a lot of rain in England. We're on a public footpath, but this is farmland, so we're being respectful of that.
As we've been walking around, have we seen anybody at the moment? No, we haven't.
Not a soul, actually. Not a soul, just sheep. And signs saying keep out. Was that the sort of reception that the police got when the investigation really kicked off? Because you talk on the one hand about close-knit communities, but Then again, people might be inclined to keep themselves to themselves and stay tight-lipped. Was it easy to question people in the local community at the time about Charles Walton's murder?
That's a $64,000 question, isn't it? I mean, it's the local PC who knew the family, who goes to the scene first at, I think it was just after 7 o'clock, and then the CID from Stratford-on-Avon were brought in. So the police, they knew their community, but how well do you know your community when there's a savage murder that's likely to be living amongst you?
So what did the police do then? Local Bobby, he goes and looks at the body, establishes that Charles Walton has been violently killed and is deceased. What happens next?
You've got to get a pathologist out to determine the cause of death and to look at the scene, and that was done on that evening. He had to come from Birmingham, I believe, Professor Webster, and he arrived about 11:30, and the body was actually removed at 1:30 in the morning. So it's really a case now of closing down the scene till the morning when you've got daylight and picking things up again, from that point.
In your experience, did they do that properly? It's 1945, we've got the benefit of hindsight, you're a modern day detective, but is that the sort of thing that they'd still do now? Is it good practice?
We've not had sight of the actual documentation from the time, but I mean the fact that the body was removed within a couple of hours and during the night time, no, I think the body would remain in situ in this scenario now with a tent over it and kept secure. You see, at that time, they're not looking for things like DNA, they're not looking for the kind of things that we would be interested in now and in need of keeping the integrity of that scene. They did what they felt was necessary at the time in order to take the investigation forward.
We're going to do a bit more walking now, so there's another gate here. I'll go through first and get it for you, all right? I don't know if it's just me, actually, but gates with rusty barbed wire on them and footpaths that lead nowhere and boggy fields where you're forever slipping and sliding. It's not welcoming, is it? I don't know if that is somehow symptomatic of the attitude of the local people to outsiders, both today and back in 1945. I've got a bit soft in my old age. So we are now pretty much as close to the top of Meon Hill as we can get without trespassing. Right, Jack?
We can see straight down now to the church.
Straight line of sight to the church.
Where First Farm was on the left with the new development. Every field has got an established hedgerow at the side. There obviously is quite a bit of work to do with those.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of work for one man to do, particularly a 72-year-old man who's up here on a relatively inhospitable February day like this with his equipment. What happened next? Tell me about the investigation, because we've established the scene and we've established that Scotland Yard was brought in and they interviewed pretty much everyone in the village, didn't they? Did they manage to isolate any key witnesses or even suspects in this?
Well, the initial thing really was to establish, the movements, and it was found out that Charles had left home shortly before 9 a.m. to work in this area that we've mentioned down here called the Hill Ground with his equipment, and off he went to do his work, and he was actually seen walking through the churchyard between 9 and 9:30. 5 minutes walk then across the fields.
The church looked, what would you say, a mile from here, a couple of kilometres, something like that? Yep.
Yeah. Now Edith, she claimed that Potter, the farm manager, had told her that he'd seen him working on the hill ground, and he came to the field to cut some hay at about 12 o'clock, and he saw Charles at his work. So we've got him, alive up until around 12 o'clock, certainly. At 11 p.m. that night, Detective Inspector from Stratford took a statement from Potter, and Potter stated he'd been at the farm for about 5 years, had known Walton for all that time, and employed him casually in the last few months. Walton had worked when the weather permitted. He'd been engaged on hedging for a previous few months, and Hillground was the last field that needed attention.
And we are looking now straight down at Hillground, aren't we? In fact, these hedgerows are full of willow trees, and it was near a willow tree that Charles Walton's body was found, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
So there's 1, 2, I can see 2, 3 stands of willow, so we must be very, very close to the spot, within a few hundred metres of where Charles Walton's body was discovered. Yeah. I wouldn't like to have to come up here in the dark on a February night. I mean, we've been sliding around all over the place, and our producer's fallen over a couple of times. I've fallen over, measurement length in a field. Don't mind sharing that. I'm covered in mud. It's an inhospitable landscape from that point of view, isn't it? And to discover a body up here, and then the shock and all of the emotion that goes with that, the adrenaline, your immediate instinct might be to run, mightn't it? And you can't really run in conditions like this. So the investigation kicks off, and then, for whatever reason, Warwickshire Police decide they're not best placed to investigate Charles Walton's murder, and so they call in a team from the Metropolitan Police in London, is that right?
Yes, from Scotland Yard, the traditional term. I don't think it was particularly a team of detectives, in any great number, but what they wanted was the experience of the senior investigators, maybe a couple of specialist advisors to help out. So it's more to give the direction, really, of the investigation.
So they get a senior officer, a very experienced detective, and in fact, this man was the foremost detective of his time, wasn't he, in England?
Yes, a guy called Fabian, yes.
Yeah, a very credible, very methodical and technically advanced kind of detective. In fact, I think in this case he actually had the RAF, the Royal Air Force, take aerial surveillance pictures of the area, didn't he?
He did. He brought a lot of experience and expertise and maybe the technical support. What he probably couldn't bring with him was an understanding of Warwickshire village life. This murder is unsolved, and I'm sure Fabian of the Yard would have been disappointed that he couldn't get to the bottom of it, but maybe his skills weren't really that good in dealing with rural communities such as this.
What were the big barriers then that he faced? Why couldn't he crack it?
I think just general secrecy, and maybe pretty proud communities. They don't want to admit that they've got a problem. They like to show things that everything's fine and dandy.
500 yards, right?
Yeah.
So he's been in the pub, he's going home, he walks past the church, he looks up here, so across 1, 2, 3, potentially 4 flat fields, yeah?
Yeah.
And then the ground rises quite steeply from there, and he can see on hill ground, which is just below us here, the figure of Charles Walton cutting the hedge in his shirt sleeves. So you can tell that he's taken his jacket off from 500 yards away, across fields. That's quite some detail, isn't it?
It is, that's the way it reads. What he means by shirt sleeves is not all that clear, although we do know that when Charles's body was found, he had his jacket on. It was a dark jacket, and underneath it, the sleeves were cut off, making it effectively a short-sleeved shirt, but he was certainly found with his jacket on.
So, I suppose the big thing here is that at some point during this whole saga, it became infected with stories of witchcraft and the occult. What's the first instance that we have of that? And is there any foundation to it?
Yeah, that came in much later. I mean, whatever folklore there was in the area and whatever people in the pub were talking about wasn't picked up particularly by that first police investigation. They were there looking at the facts, trying to find the truth. I mean, we've actually got here the request that the Chief Constable of Warwickshire sent to the Met when they decided they wanted assistance the following day.
Absolutely. Let's see what we've got here, because we've got some documentary evidence now that we can turn to. If you'd like to read that, please, Jack.
Yeah, it reads as follows. The Chief Constable has asked me to get the assistance of Scotland Yard to assist in a brutal case of murder that took place yesterday. The deceased man is named Charles Walton, aged 75, and he was killed with an instrument known as a slash hook. The murder was either committed by a madman or one of the Italian prisoners who were in a camp nearby. And that, really shows the initial thoughts of the investigation.
Wow, so where was this prisoner of war camp?
It was a couple of miles, I think, up the road here to a place called Long Marston. You're talking probably half an hour, 40 minutes walk if you needed to do it.
So Italian prisoners of war. Italy had left the war. They surrendered in 1943, didn't they? This is 1945. So what are these guys doing there as prisoners? Hadn't they been sent home? Or
they're still being detained at the camp. Clearly there was an interest in speaking to them. In fact, some of them had been away that day, and they'd been to Stratford-on-Avon to the theatre. So there's a degree of freedom being allowed them. But the point being that the investigators at the time thought they were dealing with a crazed madman or one of the prisoners of war. They're clearly announcing we're out of our depth here. We can't really deal with this.
Well, crazed madman, yeah, obviously, given the extreme violence that was meted out on Charles Walton. And then in terms of a POW, what do they mean? What's the implication? Is this somebody who's got military experience or somebody who's perhaps suffering from what we would today call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder?
There's no evidence from what I've read to suggest that. I think it's probably more maybe the local villagers were. It couldn't be one of ours, couldn't be one of the villagers who's committed this. It must have been, and then pointed the finger at the prisoners of war.
An outsider, any outsider.
What's interesting as well, right at the end of this formal request, is that they explain that a metal watch is missing from the body. Now, Edith, Charles's niece, had said that he always has this watch with him and would never leave home without it, effectively. So the details of that watch are circulated past the local pawnbrokers and jewellers. So there's an element of a possible robbery here.
Motive theft, do you think?
So that's something they would have to consider.
But then smashing somebody over the head with a walking stick, cutting their throat with a slash hook, and then pinning their body to the ground by the neck with a pitchfork, that seems disproportionate at the very least, doesn't it?
Completely. But whatever's caused this person to launch that attack on Charles Walton has clearly lost control.
Let's walk on and let's consider a few of the options and talk a bit more about the investigation. So, Jack, once again, it got a bit too wet and windy out there for us, so we jumped in the car and we've come to Long Marston, which is where the Italian prisoner of war camp was in 1945. And in fact, there are some buildings from that era in front of us in the middle of a field at the moment, rather incongruously planted in the middle of a field, which we suppose, well, what do you think at the time? Was this the prisoner of war camp?
I would think so, yeah. I mean, you've got Meon Hill looking to the right now, quite visible from
Wow,
from
it is
here.
as well. Look at this, because you can see there are some barns, and then above it there is the flat top, like a billiard table. And there's one tree just silhouetted at the top of Meon Hill.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see that place for miles around.
And you're going to have some military around here as well. You've got an airfield nearby as well, which, whether it was used for military purposes at the time, I'm sure you would have had RAF personnel as well to assist with what's going off. Looking at the case again, we've now got the officers from Scotland Yard have come up on the Friday, 2 days later, and Detective Sergeant Saunders, who was a fluent Italian speaker, begins interviewing the prisoners of war at Long Marston. Now, these prisoners were able to roam the area at will, so it was quite a relaxed operation. And although there was a schedule for them to work on certain days, but they did get 3 days, and no records were kept of their movements. On the afternoon of the murder, there were some prisoners who'd gone into Stratford to see a play at the theatre, and others had visited the cinema. But what was apparent from this inquiry at the prisoner of war camp were that none of the prisoners were under suspicion.
They eliminated the prisoner of war camp and the prisoners therein from their inquiries.
Yeah, so if you go by the initial request to Scotland Yard, they were considering the Italian prisoners of war nearby or a madman. And it's probably worth really looking at the injuries that Charles sustained to try and understand the severity of this killing.
What did the autopsy reveal?
Well, he'd been beaten about the head and his windpipe, his trachea had been cut, and his chest was badly bruised and several of his ribs were broken too.
This is the slash hook and the stick, presumably.
Yeah.
And had he tried to defend himself? Was there any evidence of that?
Yeah, it doesn't say in what order, but there were defence wounds, and obviously these are injuries where if you put your hands up to defend yourself from blows, that kind of thing, that's the classic defence wound. And on his left hand there was bruising, and the back of his right hand and forearm. And the pathologist, who came from Birmingham, concluded that Walton's wounds had been caused by the two weapons, stabbing weapon and a cutting weapon, presumably the pitchfork and the slash hook. But having been hit over the head with his own walking stick, and that was found 3 metres from the body, and there's blood and hair stuck to it. My interpretation of this is that he was beaten probably first over the head, either beaten unconscious or certainly knocked to the ground, tried to defend himself from these blows. Maybe there was then either kicked or stood on to hold him down, and then the final injuries that killed him were done probably when he was prone on the ground.
So, if a perpetrator was going to steal somebody's pocket watch, this is out of all proportion to the theft of a pocket watch, isn't it? This degree of violence in anybody's book.
Completely. He's in a remote location, so somebody's either come across him or found him knowing he was going to be there, and there must have been some build-up to get that kind of rage and that kind of anger to inflict these injuries.
And do we assume from this that whoever meant to do it set out to do it? I suppose the test for murder being that you have to intend to cause death or really serious harm in England. Is this intentional?
Yeah, it clearly is. These are injuries have been inflicted with a lot of intent. What the motive was, we don't really know. There's an interesting comment in the pathologist's report, and he died between 1 and 2 p.m. Is the estimate that the pathologist put on it. His shirt was opened and the trousers had been unfastened at his fly button. And obviously when anybody listening to this or reading this would think, is there some kind of sexual angle here? It doesn't appear that was ever really exploited or taken seriously, but you have to consider these things.
It does raise a question mark about a sexual motive, doesn't it?
It does, and again, the police quite quickly weren't happy with Potter in his account, and that's where really the inquiry went to, but it was that lack of motive that was never really explained. Had he done something on the spur of the moment to upset somebody who then just reacted disproportionately and it led to his injuries, or was there something more of a build-up? Was there an issue that had been festering for some time? If there was, you'd hope some people locally would have known about it.
Everything that comes up on Google is to do with the occult. Well, most everything that comes up is to do with the occult and Satanism and rituals, and the fact that there was a cross or a crucifix carved on Walton's chest. I mean, is there any evidence to support that?
That was certainly discounted, but I mean, what makes this sort of even worse is this Fabian from Scotland Yard who came up, the chief inspector. When he wrote his memoirs a few years later, he seems to get drawn into this folklore of witchcraft and this, that and the other. What did come about was Charles Walton was a bit of a loner and might be treated probably as a bit of an oddball in the village. Even rumours that he was something to do with witchcraft as well. I think it was just the fact that he was not one of the clique, not one of the farmers who were in the pub talking and having a laugh. He was a loner, didn't socialise or associate with anyone else in the village.
Let's go back into the village now. I want to have another walk around and see what we can turn up there. So, Jack, tell me a bit about Alfred Potter.
Yeah, I think it's worth going through the chronology really of his story, because it seems to change a little bit with timings and what actually he was doing, so people will now appreciate why the police at the time weren't happy with him. In his second interview, he stated that Walton usually worked for him about 4 days each week, but never in wet weather. He stated that he paid Walton 18 pence per hour, and usually at the end of each fortnight, although sometimes at the end of the week. And he said that he left it to Walton to say how many hours he'd worked, and he'd pay for what he claimed. And he'd last paid him for the fortnight ending the 10th of February. Potter stated on the day of the murder he'd left the College Arms, as he'd said previously, and gone across to a field known as Caxlees to see to some sheep and to feed some calves.
Well, I saw some sheep up there today, so they're still farming in much the same way, I suppose, as they were in 1945.
Pretty much unchanged, yeah. When he looked across, and he said it would be about 12:20, he then saw Walton working in his shirt sleeves. He was sure of this because it was the first time he'd seen him dressed that way, and thought he's getting on with his work today.
Right, so he's hot, he's taken his jacket off, rolled his sleeves up, or, as it turns out, he cut his sleeves off, or they'd been cut off prior.
But remember, he said he'd seen him from 500 yards away, which is quite a distance.
I was going to say, yeah, that's a long way. Yeah.
He said he would have gone over to see Walton were it not for the fact that he had a heifer that had died in the ditch and needed some attention.
He's got a dead animal to attend to, so he can't go and see his workmen. Right, okay.
So he claims he then went home and arrived there about 12:40. On the 20th of February, PC Lomasny, the local village officer, goes round to Potter and he tells him that they're hoping to get fingerprints from the murder weapons. Potter reacts to this. He says he touched the handle of the slash hook and possibly the pitchfork when he first came across the body, although he claimed he'd already mentioned this to the police, but he hadn't. He said he'd handle the weapons in response to a comment from Harry Beasley that you'd better have a look to make sure he's dead.
Yeah, I suppose it was dark, wasn't it? And he'd maybe want to feel for a pulse at his neck, so not unreasonable, I'd have said.
It's not unreasonable, although Harry Beasley said he could tell immediately that he was dead by the way he's lying. But so there's a slight change here. Now, this conversation about the possibility of fingerprints, Mrs. Potter gets involved and says, "Well, you're bound to suspect my husband if his fingerprints are on the murder weapon." And then there's also conversations about it's the work of one of the fascists, the Italians from the camp, and this, that, and the other. So the Potters are getting quite animated about the suspicion that clearly they believe is on Mr. Potter.
So already at this stage there is concern about Alfred Potter's role in those events. It might not be as innocent as he's making out.
Very much so. There's some confusion. His time seemed to change, whether he left the pub at 12, 10 past, 20 past, and then later on he talks about he went out around 1 o'clock because he saw the clock on the church. Now that's interesting because we've just been to the church, and the church clock actually has a bell on it to announce the time. So it seems like he's looking to give himself an alibi to say that he couldn't have been involved in this death because he was with other people.
Well, we're back in the village now, Jack, and we've just popped into the porch at St Swithin's to get out of the wind. So far, the police have ruled out any involvement by Italian prisoners of war. They're all accounted for. And they've got 500 witness statements from all over the village, including that of Alfred Potter, who at the moment seems to be the person whose account is the least consistent.
His story keeps changing, yes, so they're concerned about him. I think the other thing as well is that of all the witnesses they're seeing over these 3 or 4 days, no one's seen a stranger or somebody behaving oddly or whatever. There's no suggestion of this strange madman that may potentially have been about. So the focus comes back to Mr. Potter. And when this line of inquiry or suggestion that there may be fingerprints on the weapon, Potter claims, well, there would be because I touched the weapons anyway to check that he wasn't still alive when they found Charles Walton. And Mrs. Potter gets excited about this as well, saying that, well, of course you'll think it's my husband if there's prints are on the murder weapons. And at the time when the PC's at the house, there's a serviceman arrives, a military person comes and asks for Potter. Bear in mind he's the manager of the farm and has probably got quite a bit of influence and responsibility in the area. And this serviceman talks about one of the prisoners of war who'd been arrested for somebody who'd stolen some clothes. And Potter gets all excited about this. Said, "Oh, there you are! It's one of these fascists from the prisoner of war camp." So he's almost gloating as though this is evidence that it's nothing to do with him, that it's one of these fascists. So,
do you think he's trying to pin it on the outsider?
He seems to be, and we know from that early request to Scotland Yard they talk about the prisoners of war. So maybe the village was coming up with this. They didn't want to think that it was one of their own, that it must be an outsider. And what better outsider than the enemies of war?
It must be a pretty tough time to be an Italian POW around here. You know, your country's capitulated in 1943. You're still subject to some form of internment here as a foreign national. Probably don't speak the language, and you're surrounded by people who are so suspicious of you, they're prepared to, allegedly, pin a murder on you.
Yes, I mean, you get the impression that these villagers don't take to these people and there's no love lost between them.
Yeah, right, okay. So what happens next then? What's the next step in the saga? So Potter's got presumably an alibi and he's got some sort of reason why his fingerprints are on the murder weapons. What happens next?
Well, he's spoken to again a few days later, and he talks about he'd gone home and read the paper for a few minutes, and then he goes out with another farm worker, a guy called Charles Happy Bachelor, to pump some mangolds. Bear in mind there's talk of him checking on the calves, the sheep, the heifer in the ditch, and now he's introducing some other task.
It's all agricultural work, isn't it? They pulp those up, it's winter feed for cattle.
Yeah, indeed, but he's introducing the other things, and he also says that both him and Mr. Batchelor had gone to look at the church clock and saw that it was 1 o'clock. Mrs. Potter confirms this, that he arrived home after 12:30 and read the paper.
It's getting more complicated, isn't it, this? Well, he's just nipped home and saw Charles Walton up the field.
Yeah, his wife has conveniently seen him at home at 12:40, and then he said he actually walked past and checked the time of the clock.
Happy Bachelor's corroborating it all because he was doing something with me. It does make you wonder, doesn't it, if all of this is being cooked up as a defence for Alfred Potter.
To alibi him at the time of the actual killing. So As in any police inquiry, and it's probably even more so now, we start to look at people's financial background. Are they in debt, either the victim or the suspect? And this hawk that Potter said that he effectively paid Mr. Walton more than he was probably due. He trusted him to give the hours that he wanted paying for. It turns out it was actually quite the opposite. What Potter was doing was claiming more for his staff, but he wasn't paying them less. So he was making a pretty good living out of almost being a gangmaster, where he had control of all the money and he gave his staff whatever he thought they were worth.
Well, surely that would give Charles Walton an excuse for wanting to whack Alfred Potter over the head with his walking stick, wouldn't it?
It would give him an excuse probably to complain about what was happening, but I guess as a gangmaster or a farm manager, he's got some control over these individuals and appears to be doing just what he wanted. Whether that's sufficient motive to go on and have a confrontation that leads to his death, it's still pretty excessive.
I was going to say, having your wage packet short by a few shillings a week and confronting the boss over it, that doesn't seem to me to be sufficient motive for the boss to smack you over the head with your walking stick, cut your throat with a slash hook, and then pin your lifeless body to the ground with a pitchfork.
Exactly.
To be blunt, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. And what threat was Mr. Walton to Potter, other than challenging him about the money he may have been owed? But we know that Walton, as well, lived a very reclusive life, so he hadn't got an expensive lifestyle. What I would be interested in from a detective now is to know what lifestyle Mr. Potter actually had. Was he a happily married man living at home and running the farm, or had he got some other activities or something else that he was involved with?
You're going back to the sexual motive, maybe?
Possibly sexual, yes. There's all kinds of scenarios here that you would certainly have to consider. What was his relationship like with his wife? With Edith, who is Charles Walton's niece. She's 33. Apparently she did have a boyfriend at the time.
Right.
She was working away, but is there some other issues that are going off maybe in the background?
Was it just the case that at the time people didn't ask questions like that because it was indiscreet and impolite?
I think it probably was, yes. Right. And the thing is, you don't leave the same trail as you would do now, with social media and other things. And this village life, as I say, they probably don't want to suggest or even raise any suspicions about the activities of their own people.
And it was against the law to be gay as well, so today no problem being gay or bi, but in a small insular rural English community like this in the 1940s, something like that would have been, well, certainly a social stigma if it had got out, and maybe even an excuse for blackmail.
It makes
Probably
you wonder.
Definitely an excuse for blackmail, thinking about it. Yeah.
It makes you wonder how many frank conversations were had with these police inquiries about people's lifestyles.
Would that be a reason for, well, let's say if Alfred Potter had propositioned Charles Walton up at the hedge that day, or Charles Walton had said to Alfred Potter, I know all about you and your carryings on with other men, would that have been sufficient motive, do you think, for Alfred Potter to have murdered Charles Walton in the way that Charles Walton was murdered?
I think it would certainly have fired up the emotions, yes, because there's no apparent evidence of a build-up, of a dispute that's been festering. If there was, it was either not talked about, or it didn't exist, or it hadn't happened, and there wasn't that kind of build-up.
It's a great eruption of violence, isn't it? Certainly.
Exactly. The other thing I'm concerned here as well, and I've not been able to see from the documentation, is Alfred Potter is 40 years old. Why has he not done any military service at the time?
I think possibly because if he's working on the land, he'd be in a reserved occupation, so he might be exempt from military service.
That could well be the case, but let's think as well that maybe a young or a man of 40, fit and able, who by chance of his employment was not liable to serve the country and go and fight, there might have been some other added stresses put on that. Maybe Walton could have even suggested, well, you should be fighting for your country rather than ripping us off and taking our wages. So, this is wartime. There's
the whole white feather cowardice from the First World War.
Yeah. It might be another reason for the killer or for Mr. Potter to react to the level that he did.
It's not looking good for Alfred Potter at the moment, is it? I mean, we've pretty much got him banged to rights just talking here in the church porch. Is there anybody else who's in the picture for this? Or is it pretty much Alfred Potter, in your mind, who killed Charles Walton?
I'm going by the summary of the case, and they clearly didn't suspect anybody else. Now, when Scotland Yard left and went back to London, they basically said, well, we believe it's Potter, but there's no evidence of motive or any hard evidence to connect to him, so he can't be charged. So the case was effectively dropped. Now, what I don't think is evident is how well they've plotted the movements of the people in the village, because 500 people being interviewed, where were you, what were you doing, would be able to establish that there was no stranger seen walking through the village, there was nobody sleeping rough at that particular time, there was no one behaving oddly. Well, there's a snapshot been taken here of that Valentine's Day 1945, and if there's nobody else potentially involved in this, then that focus on Potter is even stronger.
So there are deficiencies in the evidence gathering that would be addressed by a modern incident room. Isn't it the great privilege of historians that we have the benefit of hindsight and we can make these judgments and sit in judgment on our fellow human beings all these years later? And we've got all of this wisdom, haven't we now? You put yourself in Robert Fabian's shoes. He had a pretty much impossible task on his hands, didn't he? Because nobody had talked to him. Well, they would, but they wouldn't tell him what he needed to know.
He did. We're not being critical particularly of the investigation, and we're no better as individuals now maybe at talking to people. However, we do have scientific advantages. Potter was described as wearing corduroy trousers at the time, and there were 2 marks on the front of his trousers that were believed to be bloodstains. But it's been described that his trousers had been cleaned, and it's too thoroughly for any kind of positive analysis. Now, we all know in this day and age that something like that would have been looked at and it would have been identified as blood and whose blood that it came from. So that is pretty crucial.
Are these trousers still in a box somewhere? Is it possible to go back and get them and take them to a lab and get a Home Office pathologist to do some analysis?
We've not spoken with the originating police force, but there's nothing been written about this case that suggests there have been, so that evidence has now been lost. But I think the question that you'd need to say is, when were they washed? And there's nothing coming out of that to say when that happened. When were they seized? When might have they been cleaned? Had they been cleaned thoroughly, or just the area where the blood was? But again, that would all add to the circumstantial evidence that we've got.
And you can see how, if this is pushed forward theoretically and Alfred Potter comes to trial, it wouldn't be a particularly difficult job for a defence barrister to sow that seed in the mind of the jury that all of the evidence was compromised and corrupted and therefore should be disregarded.
Well, exactly, and Fabian, before he's left and gone back to London, he's almost answered those kind of questions. He said that there was no evidence that Potter was a violent man, no evidence that he and Walton had ever quarrelled, and he described Potter as morose and sullen in interview, even when closely interrogated. He never lost his temper, and he was civil. He said he's convinced that he's far from being dull-witted, and he's a man of considerable strength and a cunning individual, but he just simply hasn't got that motive or that evidence.
So, with our benefit of hindsight, and of course many decades of policing experience and revisions in police practice and detective work since then, as a former detective yourself, would you be comfortable in ordering the 6 o'clock knock for Alfred Potter?
I think with a full review of the documentation and proper analysis of a timeline of where people are, with that hindsight, if you like, I think Mr. Potter would certainly deserve the 6 o'clock knock and come into interrogation for a day or so, and also to put a little bit of leverage on those crucial witnesses that he's relying on that maybe didn't happen at the time.
Oh, I see. Shake the tree, see what fruit falls, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So Mrs. Potter, happy bachelor, we need to get under their skin really to elicit a reaction. We've seen how they've reacted before, and really it needs to be put put on a level to them so that they decide whether they're going to risk giving a false alibi to a killer or to tell the truth.
So Alfred Potter's in a cell, and that in turn turns up the pressure on Happy Bachelor and Alfred Potter's wife, because they then realise how serious this is, and I suppose the implication for them of performing a criminal act by lying to the police about where Alfred Potter was and what he was doing.
Yes, if these inquiries had been sort of routine, speaking to all the village over the period of time that the inquiry took place, everyone appeared to be comfortable in saying nothing or saying sufficient to back Mr. Potter up. But when the inquiry is ramped up considerably and people can get under the skin of these people, then maybe the truth would have been something different.
So what happens if you fail to get under the skin of people like Mrs. Potter, Happy Bachelor? You've got Alfred Potter in a police cell. Nobody's talking. Do you have to let him go? Where does the case go from there?
That's where cases do struggle and are not solved, particularly in those cases when you've got less scientific and less forensic evidence involved. But they were the tools of the trade back then. It's how people were spoken to. And maybe a tight-knit rural village was not the kind of community that these Scotland Yard officers were used to speaking to.
So in 1945, in a place like Lower Quinton, if everybody kept their lip buttoned up, you could get away with murder.
Exactly, and I think that's what's happened here.
So, Jack, cheers. We've made it as far as the College Arms, a non-alcoholic beverage for me. And what have you got there?
Irish whiskey for me.
Oh, goodness gracious.
Thank you very much.
Old habits die hard, you're welcome. And Alfred Potter, he's going to get the 6 o'clock
Alfred
knock.
Potter, definitely a modern-day 6 o'clock knock.
Serious business, then. Serious business.
Yeah, there's a lot of work goes before the 6 o'clock knock because it's our time. We're in control to sort the job out.
The 6 o'clock knock. You heard it here first. Jack, cheers again, mate.
Cheers.
Proper job.
The 6 o'clock knock is presented by Simon Ford and Jack Morrell and produced by Paul Bradshaw and is available on every major listening app. Please help us spread the word by giving us a 5-star review and telling your friends to subscribe.